The same struggle went on with the Japanese. The United States saying what? Throw your farmers out of business. We have cheaper rice. And the Japanese are saying, but we value our farmers and we value their being employed. What difference does it make? We are talking about a free trade system here. And if people are thrown out of business, so be it. And so these are the things that are occurring behind so-called GATT agreements, behind NAFTA agreements, and other agreements. And it is time, African ladies and gentlemen, that you begin to study these issues simply because they are talks between white men and so forth and Asian men, and simply because the terms may not be readily familiar does not mean that they have nothing to do with you. They have everything to do with you. You must recognize that with these so-called agreements, Africa and African people are being isolated out of the world markets. For instance, in this GATT agreement, the people who run the textile industries in South Carolina and in North Carolina, the industries where some of your relatives, I'm sure, may be employed, an industry that employs a large number of African Americans. These people who ran those industries had to struggle with the American negotiators to protect those textile mills for another 10 years. But after 10 years, the agreement is that the textiles from China and other parts of the world will be permitted a free-flowing market in America, and therefore the American textile industry will probably disappear to be around no longer. And that means the African Americans and other people who are employed in those industries will be unemployed.
In his lecture on Black economics and Black people's global relationship with their oppressors, Dr. Amos Wilson critically examines the historical ongoing dynamics of agreements between white nations and non-white communities, particularly Black people. He highlights that white societies have historically failed to honor agreements with non-white nations and have often structured these agreements to exclude or disempower Black people. Dr. Wilson emphasizes that Black people's economic destiny remains under the control of white societies, keeping Black communities in increasingly marginalized positions. Dr. Wilson argues that Black Americans' current economic and social position has deteriorated from second class to third or fourth class status, reflecting their systematic exclusion from global trade and economic empowerment. He asserts that Black people have been isolated and stripped of their economic influence, leaving them dependent on white-controlled systems for survival. This dependency, he explains, results from a lack of self-determined economic initiatives and a failure to establish a cohesive economic bloc, leaving Black communities vulnerable and increasingly disposable in the eyes of global powers.
In fact, many of the industries that will be wiped out by so-called free trade are the very industries where the bulk of African Americans are employed today and at this moment. So these are not abstract talks between white men and Asian men and other men. These are talks that have direct effects on our lives as a people. And we should know what they are. It is a shame anyway that we let people who are less than 5% of the globe determine the economic destiny of the globe. That a bunch of men who call themselves men, Black men who call themselves men, but who are at heart total cowards, would let another bunch of white boys determine their economic destiny. Have meetings among themselves and determine how we shall live. What group of real men have their highest aspirations as that involving being employed by the men of another ethnic group? It is an amazing situation that Black men have seen themselves as the permanent second bananas of white men who are getting angry. You hear a book out here now talked about the anger of the successful Negroes. You know, you should be angry. You should be angry with yourself. You are angry because the white boys are not letting you in. What a shame. Why aren't you creating your own industries? But let's look again at the NAFTA. Where were the Afro-Caribbean nations in that agreement? Where were the African nations during that agreement? Let's look at the GATT agreements. Where does Africa fit in those agreements? What you have going on here, ladies and gentlemen, is almost a total isolation of African people across the whole diaspora. You have a NAFTA agreement, which is essentially a club between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And the members of this club are giving each other special privileges. Privileges that will be denied other people who are not members of the club. They will get special discounts, access to special markets, special protections, special financing, and other kinds of things because they are a member of the NAFTA club. And yet we see no African nations and no people who are part of that. You talk about trading with Africa, you talk about trading with the Caribbean nations. What is going to happen when you decide to trade with the Caribbean nations and trade with the African nations and find out that you cannot enter into the kind of trade you want to because the methods you have chosen to trade run against the NAFTA agreements? That the United States has agreed with the Mexicans or agreed with the Canadians that certain products outside of their club cannot be imported into the country. Or that products that are imported into the country must be taxed in some special sort of way. And yet you're a part of the so-called nation. You talk about trade, you talk about exporting materials to Africa. Well, what if the materials or the services you plan to export to Africa run up again against NAFTA agreements? This is what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. Serious issues. It is time for African American people to get over our ignorance. You got to read more than books written by black folk because the books are not covering enough territory. You cannot let yourself be deceived by people who tell you simply because books are written by white folk, you should not read them. White folk don't write every book to deceive black folk. They don't write every book with you in mind. Why do black people have problems reading? Because they're not taught well in school? Not really. The problems black people have with reading has nothing to do with academia. What are we saying here? The problem that we have with reading as a people is a political problem that expresses itself in school as an academic problem. What do I mean by that? I mean by that there is so much information in America. Real information, factual information, information everywhere you look, free-flowing information. So in order for us to be ignorant, we have to will ourselves to be ignorant. In a sense, we must be dumb in America in order not to take advantage of the information available to us. In other words, there is so much information available that if we truly could read as a people, and I'm not talking about technical reading, there are those who have great vocabularies who still can't read. We truly must not be interested in reading in order for this information to flow around us the way it does. In other words, we have to fall asleep over our books. We have to get headaches when we read. We have to lack interest in reading. We have to, if we are men, see reading as a feminine activity, as something that we are not supposed to do, as something that's exclusively the right of white boys. In other words, these kinds of attitudes must be psychologically and politically induced in the black mind so that whites can enjoy freedom of speech and lay out every means, line by line and chapter by chapter, of how they rule African people and maintain us in subordination. This is what it's about, and it's here, and it's available for us. And yet we are not availing ourselves to the information. We are entering into an age now where the wars are not the wars so much which involve military might, but what we call econo-wars. Wars of economy, where nations will be defeated and destroyed as effectively by their economic positions and struggles as they used to be defeated in terms of military struggles. Ronald Reagan and the white conservatives made up their minds years ago that they would destroy Russia, not in terms of dropping bombs on Russia, but that they would spin Russia into the ground. And what they would do would keep escalating the cost of weapons and keep escalating military budgets. And as the Russians sought to keep up with them in military spending, ultimately Russia would collapse economically. And that is exactly what happened, and the Russian Empire fell apart. And today Clinton is in Russia getting ready to feed on that nation like vultures. And the Eastern Europeans who were a part of the so-called Warsaw Pact now want to join NATO. Why? Because of the wars of economics. And these nations are now teaming up to make war against African nations and African people. We can talk then about the regional agreement between Asian nations, and African nations are not a part of those agreements. We can talk about the regional agreements in Latin America. They're now setting up Chile, and they're now setting up Argentina to be the next members of the NAFTA Accords. In other words, ultimately, the United States will wrap in the whole of Central and South America into the NAFTA club, along with Canada. Where are the Caribbean Africans in this situation? In other words, then, we see Europe creating a community of nations. And we see ultimately Europe uniting with Eastern Europe and the other parts of Europe. We will ultimately see Islamic nations creating economic blocs. And where then are the African blocs, and where is the Pan-African economic system? We got Negroes over here singing "We Shall Overcome" and talking about they're a part of some multicultural society, and talking about diversity in the workplace. Getting over ethnicity when the whole world is combining in terms of ethnicity. But this is the game. This is the game we've fallen for century after century. People talking one thing and doing another. And now we see that the African Americans are being isolated in this very nation. We are now more segregated in this nation than we were in the 1920s. You read here recently that the level of segregation of black children, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, is now at its, in schools, is now back at its 1960s levels. We have reached the point where the black male is essentially economically obsolete and useless. And this is at the bottom of this war that's getting ready to develop on the black male. I warned you in on black violence that this whole issue about crime in the black community was but a setup, a rationalization for the genocidal attack against the black community. I warned you on black violence that if you really looked at the statistics, the greatest crooks and criminals in America are American white men. That this nation is a criminal nation. It is a supreme mafia. You heard me say that earlier. You heard me say that this nation has been at the center of wars that have destroyed within the 20th century some 167 million people. And yet they have convinced you that the threat to the world is the black male and the black drug dealer, as if the threat to the life of the world is in the hands of black men. You could have 10,000 black men on these streets every night, mugging 100 people apiece, and you would never begin to equal the number of people killed and destroyed by white males. But yet they're convincing you that a black male is a criminal. And what am I saying then? In order for us to be in the condition we're in, we have to literally be turned backwards. The victims of criminality have to be made to appear to be the criminals, and the criminals made to appear to be victims. When you talk about drug addiction, you're made to think that this is a major problem in the black community, and it is, but it's much more a major problem in the white community. Definitely. But why are we made to believe that we are the bulk of the drug addicts? Why are we made to believe that we generate the bulk of violent crime? In every criminal category, you will see that white males outrank black males. Just as in every welfare category, you will see white folk far exceeding black folk in numbers. In every area where people talk about entitlements, you will find that it is the white middle class and the white upper class that gets the largest bulk of government money. But yet when you hear the term entitlement programs, you automatically think of black folk. And yet when you hear the terms of welfare, you automatically think of black folk. And yet when you hear the term of violence and criminality, you automatically think what? Black folk. Yet whites are not unfamiliar with the actual figures. They have them. It means then, ladies and gentlemen, when a people ignores a set of facts, when they insist in the face of the facts, in believing in opposition to the facts, then the issue is not about truth. We have some people in our community who believe that if they keep telling white folk the truth, they're going to transform the American situation. We're going to talk truth to power. You're going to talk truth to power, all right, and get crushed for talking it. Why didn't the people tell the emperor he had no clothes? Because they recognized that telling him the truth placed them in danger. Only a naive child would talk truth and get away with it. So the issue is not about truth and telling white folk the truth of African history, the truth of our contributions to America, the truth of our great ancient past. For these people are not going to give up their privileges and wealth and power merely because they learned that you are Egyptians, or because you've contributed to American wealth, or these other things. It's too addictive for that. They will say, so what? Good for you. We are still holding on to what we got. And if you get in the way of what we got, we will crush you, Egyptian past or not. So the idea then that you're going to have a truth crusade that will rescue you from the subordination to white power is an illusion, and one you should rapidly get over. We're dealing here then, as I mentioned, with the uselessness of the African male and the fact that this system no longer has a place for the African male except for prison. And this, of course, is demonstrated by the fact that this white legislature is willing to pass a bill that spends $22 billion to build 10 additional federal prisons and to contribute to the building of prisons in states. It is willing to add 47 to 52 new laws that require the death penalty. It adds on to its many statutes a requirement that states treat 13-year-old black males and 13-year-olds as adults, and that they lay on them mandatory sentences so that they can spend lifetimes in prisons. They have lowered the treatment, the age of treatment, so that in a sense they can literally pick up young men out on the street in their, not hardly even into their teens, and lock them in the jails for the rest of their lives. So the issue here then is not an issue of whether black boys need to be trained into jobs and so forth. The issue is that the American economy is being transformed in such a way that there are few, if any, jobs for black men. It means, ladies and gentlemen, that the African American community must become a creator of jobs for its own people. Sidney Wilhelm said in the book, a seminal book which you cannot find, but an excellent book, Who Needs the Negro, written back in 1967, a classic book. The Negro becomes a victim of neglect as he becomes useless to an emerging economy of automation. With the onset of automation, the Negro moves out of his historical state of oppression into one of uselessness. We don't have time to talk about that phrase, you see. But America will become less overtly racist to the point where we become less useful to it. In other words, we're not going to block you from having freedom to do things, but the deal is you won't have money to do it. And so, you know, we're going to create fair everything, except the situation is you won't be in a position to take advantage of it.
The lecture critiques Black Americans' reluctance to engage in critical reading and learning about the mechanisms of global oppression and white supremacy. Dr. Wilson views this aversion to education as a socially engineered issue designed to maintain white dominance by keeping black people uninformed and unable to challenge systematic injustices. He stresses that despite the availability of information, black communities often choose ignorance, perpetuating their subjugation and allowing oppressors to operate unchallenged. Dr. Wilson also examines the economic obsolescence facing black men and black communities as a whole. As black people become economically irrelevant in white-dominated systems, their disposability increases, exacerbating their vulnerability to systematic oppression. Furthermore, he critiques the portrayal of black men as the global face of criminality and poverty, despite white communities benefiting more from government assistance. This misrepresentation reinforces negative stereotypes and sustains white supremacy by masking white society's crimes and economic reliance on state support. Finally, Dr. Wilson calls for black Americans to wake up and recognize the realities of the world and their oppressors' realities. He urges black communities to develop self-sufficient economic systems to prevent becoming a permanently dependent and powerless race. By reclaiming control over their economic and social destinies, black people can resist the systematic forces of white supremacy that have historically marginalized and exploited them. Dr. Wilson concludes that liberation requires proactive and informed action, as white supremacy will not relinquish its power voluntarily.